Good afternoon. Thank you once again for joining us. We're going to go through this one reasonably quickly today because I think we want to get to the discussion as soon as we possibly can. Effectively, this morning,
Good afternoon. Thank you once again for joining us.
Give me a second. I just need to mute my audio on this side. Thank you. This morning, we put out a media release, which was titled How to Fix Our Broken SOEs and Award Every Voter 50,000 Rand. Now, the premise around this is that every single South African, we are owners of the SOEs. We're talking Eskom, Transnet, PRASA, South African Airways, and there are 711 other state-owned entities, right down to the likes of Pick It Up and Johannesburg Water and all of these things. And we've entrusted Parliament generally to manage most of these on our behalf for the past 25 years. But the mismanagement of our SOEs has resulted in theft on a scale that we have not seen for many, many years. So we are proposing, through the Capitalist Party, a new and very radical approach. We are demanding that government ownership of the state-owned enterprises is handed over to the citizens of South Africa. Now, a lot of people immediately want to know what we mean when we talk about this. Well, the model has actually been carried out successfully before. When we had the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union at the end of 1980, around about 1989, a lot of the countries in Eastern Europe went this route in terms of their state-owned enterprises, where ownership was turned over directly to the citizens of the country. So essentially, there is a precedent for the model that we're proposing. But more crucially, from our point of view, it's not just about the SOEs, but it's true empowerment in the sense that the end result will be the firing of the politically connected elites and unleashing economic activity from the ground up. So here are the mechanics that we're proposing. So we're starting with every registered voter, and people want to know why we're not talking about citizens. Well, right now, our view is that people who have decided that they want to play a role in the future of the government are registered voters, but we're happy to have our arms twisted on this. But right now, we're saying every registered voter should get a portfolio of shares across all of these state-owned entities, Eskom, SAA, AXA, Transnet, and across all of the others. And the process itself will cost the fiscus very little because we are converting the one current shareholder, which is the state, over to many. So in other words, we're giving shares to every adult that's registered as a voter. Of course, now as shareholders, citizens won't know how much each portfolio will be worth on the day that their handover and trading begins, because the share price of the traded in entities will immediately go up or down in many cases, as per supply and demand. However, we've done a calculation of the net value of all of the SOEs based on the balance sheets that they have to produce as part of their annual reports. And so that is information that is publicly available. And our calculation right now, based on the amounts that we've tallied, is that we will be in a position to award a minimum value of at least 50,000 Rand per voter in terms of the value of all of the SOEs. We work on the assumption that the distribution of these share certificates can be automated. We can deliver them via banks, post office, social security payment services. All of these things are already in place. Immediately at the point at which we do that, citizens will then be in a position to sell some or all of their shares as they wish, or sit on them, or buy others on the open market, or use them as collateral for credit, or whatever. It ends up being their choice. We currently don't have a portfolio on whether, we don't have a position on whether these share portfolios should be weighted in favor of lower income groups, because we might want to consider doing that. 50,000 Rand is a significantly larger amount of money for people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum than for people at the upper end. But we certainly are in a position to award a minimum of 50,000 per voter, and then look at how we distribute the rest of it among the other shareholders. So initially, the plan is that Parliament will continue to act as a proxy for the shareholders, but this will change as the shareholders then assign their proxy to other groups that they trust more. So these might be other shareholders. They might be special interest groups. They might be lobby groups. They might be non-governmental organizations. They might be religious groups. But ultimately, we will have a significant change in terms of how people start to contribute to the management of these state-owned entities, and how the boards then get appointed for these state-owned entities. Shareholder meetings, AGMs of entities like Transnet or Eskom and so forth, will no longer be held in Sandton Auditorium. We'll probably hold them in places like FNB Stadium, with crossovers to stadia around the country as well, and of course right here on live broadcasts on YouTube. And our view very simply is a board that fails to increase shareholder value, they will be fired and replaced in a dynamic people's capitalism. Now, the inherent morality of this position for us is very clear. The best form of upliftment is to let people have money, not just services. And this gives choice and opens up horizons of opportunity. And what we have here is a real opportunity to give real economic freedom to people. We expect the ruling elite and the other parties to come up with all sorts of excuses as to why they think this is not feasible, but we believe that we have solutions to every one of those excuses that they're willing to come up with. So that, in broad brushstrokes, is what we are proposing. And before we hand over to questions, I'm going to ask my colleague Roman to come in. Roman?
Thank you, Chair. Well, yes, I think it's important to note how it works currently. So currently, the profits of the SOEs are privatized to the state, but the losses are subsidized by taxpayers like us. So the upside is not gained by the people who pay the money for the SOEs to continue. So basically, the proposal is that the SOEs were created with our money and are currently run with our money. And we've asked people to do that on our behalf, namely Parliament and the Executive, and they, order the wrong train size, and they enter into dodgy deals for coal with Eskom. So we can't trust politicians to do the job that we are supposed to do. So to get a bit of skin in the game for citizens, generally speaking, since we already paid for these state-owned enterprises, I think it's very important that we are able to own a share of these enterprises as well, so that we have skin in the game as citizens, so that people get money out of the state-owned enterprises, because we are the state and we own those enterprises. And thirdly, it's about accountability at the end of the day. If you own something, if you own a share in something, you have authority to critique how it's run, to make changes, and a variety of the things that we currently do not have now. Now we are sort of beholden on the people that the executive or parliament puts in there. But if we own shares in those things, we have a lot more control and power to change things in the state-owned enterprises as well.
Yes, I think a very specific example that we have right now is if we take a look at Eskom as a let's hone in on Eskom as a specific example. The board of Eskom insists on paying the executives at Eskom performance bonuses, in spite of the fact that the way in which that organization is run is a complete disaster. Now, as shareholders, I would work on the assumption that nearly every single one of us as citizens would turn around and say it is completely unacceptable when you are actually milking us dry in terms of subsidies that keep getting plowed into Eskom, for you to be paying yourself these bonuses. And in fact, we insist that until such time as Eskom is in fact turned around, that we reverse the situation and in fact insist that all of you take cuts in pay. So that is a very specific example of how shareholder action can be brought to bear on the assumption that all of us as shareholders are able to act directly upon that. Roman?
Right. But it's also about appointing the right people to the job. I mean, I read over the weekend another SOE, I don't know if it's PRASA, but they appointed a new board and no one has experience in being an executive director at PRASA. I think it's PRASA, I could be wrong. But basically we are appointing people that do not have the experience to run those things. And that needs to change. And we can't wait for politicians to find a backbone or for them to become more accountable to us, because there's no incentive to do so. if every citizen or every voter owns a share, we can really rally together, create forums to find out who is the best people to run that enterprise, of course.
Okay, there's a couple of questions. I think let's take them. Firstly, from, Dylan Kruger wants to know, with the share ownership model, how does the decision-making process work at the state-owned enterprises? Is there not a risk of too many chiefs in the camp? Essentially, right now, if you look at very large companies like SA Breweries, as an example, where there are literally hundreds of thousands of shareholders in SA Breweries, the decision-making process still takes place because every year there's an AGM, there's resolutions that are intended for the AGM get proposed, and people end up voting on these resolutions. It's simply the same thing that takes place at a larger scale. So it's not as though this has not been done before. It continues to be done for extremely large companies around the world. And effectively, what we are trying to do is to bring the rules that currently apply to every listed company on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange to also apply to the state-owned enterprises. Roman?
So there is a question from Gareth. How will unions fit into the picture? Well, hopefully unions will be able to own the shares as well to the state-owned enterprises. And I mean, if they are worried about their workers at those enterprises, they should be well aware that we are going to be, focused on improvement and on service and on deliverables rather than a labor aristocracy that we have at the moment. So the unions will obviously have shares in their individual members as well. So there's a lot more skin in the game for the unions to be a lot more accountable to the shareholders, i.e. the entire country.
Someone has asked a question. 6 Foot Scream, whoever you are, anonymous person. 6 Foot Scream says, well, they can't be shut down at once. No one's proposing that we shut down anything. However, in the case of entities like South African Airways, we are of the view that South African Airways probably should be shut down, in which case we shut down South African Airways. There's currently, their balance sheet reflects something like 15 billion rand, and we distribute that among the shareholders. So that's one very specific example of where the shareholders, that is the citizens of the country, could then directly take that decision to say that this business is unlikely to make more money based on the fact that we're not willing to inject more capital into running this business. Therefore, let's go ahead and shut it down. Let's see what else we've got.
So let me just read one from Dean quickly. Is there a risk of too many shares being in the hands of a few, after a period of time? Well, that's exactly what we have now, except that the people who have the shares in the SOEs are the state, and they are voted on, by members of the public like us. So to get to that stage of concentration of wealth, it might be a possibility in a decade or two, depending on how people want to sell their shares or accumulate them in various ways. But it's a lot more difficult to accumulate shares of 30 million people and concentrate those rather than right now it being concentrated in the state as it is today. So maybe there might be an issue later on with a sort of natural monopoly that flourishes, but I find it hard to believe that it will be anywhere as bad as it is today.
Certainly. I'd just like to pick up on the question of the unions again. And this is actually a significant point for us because a number of us have been of the view for the longest time that the way in which we actually eliminate labor unrest on an ongoing basis is by actually giving the workers, particularly in terms of mining. Let's take mining as an example. If we were to have a scenario where the workers actually had direct ownership of a percentage of the mines, and their remuneration was then tied directly to the concept of their productivity. So in other words, they'd effectively be able to write their own salary checks. We would then end up with a situation where strike days would actually go down. But crucially, it requires modification of our labor laws, which is what currently holds us in place. Because in that scenario where the workers are effectively earning dividends and not salaries anymore, it would mean that there are going to be very good years where their salaries actually go up drastically, and there are going to be years where their salaries go down drastically. Now take the same business model and apply it to every state-owned entity that currently experiences strike days. We think very strongly that there's a case to be made for reform of our labor laws so that instead of workers being remunerated in the forms of salaries, that they actually effectively end up earning dividends. It provides them with skin in the game for them to continue to ensure that those businesses actually prosper. And on the assumption that their productivity goes up as a result, they effectively write their own paychecks. But as we said, that requires substantial modification to the labor laws.
Right, and that's been examples of that is Germany, where a lot of the unions have members of the board of the unions on the board of the companies as well, and make sure that the company runs well as that they're looking after the workers as well. So interesting question from Sean, which I seem to have lost, but basically in terms of Eskom, what about the deregulation of the market and allowing other service providers such as solar, wind to be able to provide power to the grid? Yeah, absolutely. The only reason Eskom is using coal is because of distorted incentives, i.e. corruption, because they built these two coal power plants that are still not ready. And if you look at what is happening with the load shedding, it's the quality of coal that's a problem as well. And you look at the Gupta to get a mine deal, all those things are not because coal is cheap or effective. It's because it's the easiest thing, easiest contracts to loot and to corrupt. So, I mean, in terms of Eskom, people buy shares in Eskom, but as the ZACP, we fully expect to deregulate the market and allow electricity to be sold privately as well.
Someone was asking the question whether proposing that the workers have a share of production, is that actually not socialism? No, actually, it's the essence of capitalism, that you have companies that are owned by shareholders, and we are just simply proposing that the workers in those particular companies effectively end up being a shareholder block. We're not suggesting that they control the majority of shares in those in the mines, as an example, but we are saying that if they end up having a significant chunk and they have board representation and they're able to actually play a role in terms of getting a sense of how the finances actually work, I believe that we'll actually have a far healthier business climate than we currently do. The business climate right now is entirely antagonistic based on the fact that every incentive on the part of the labor union bosses to go on strike is there, because the labor union bosses, remember, get paid no matter what happens. But the striking workers end up falling for, well, effectively, because no work, no pay applies, they go on strike for 2 months and they end up losing 2 months worth of salary. And so at the end of the year, their total amount of money that they end up earning is significantly less than they would have had if they had not gone on strike in the first place. So I think that there are all of these benefits that kick in. But going back to the question of the SOEs, someone else asked, why do we not just simply sell them off? Well, effectively right now, our government is highly unlikely to insist on selling off the SOEs, even though we've been saying for years that this actually needs to be done. But by insisting that every citizen, who effectively are the shareholders in the SOE, gets direct control of the SOEs, then we are creating a situation where we are allowing the individual shareholders to take that decision. So there might well be a decision to shut down South African Airways. There might well be a decision to take Eskom and partition it into multiple companies, or even sell off each of the power stations separately and monetize the system that way. So those are the broad brushstrokes that we are talking about. And I see that Duncan McLeod has now joined us as well. Duncan, we're just going through the questions that have been flowing through on the timeline, and I'm just going to take a quick look.
So says,
isn't this the same idea that Russia implemented in the 90s, where the former USSR companies had shares given to citizens? And then goes on to say Russia's economy was destroyed in the 90s. Roman, do you want to pick it up, or Duncan, do you want to pick it up?
Let me just answer, then I have to run to a meeting. So basically what happened in Russia is they had privatization, but they had privatization to certain people, because basically what they had was all these state-owned enterprises, but they want to sell them for the value of the state-owned enterprise, or sometimes a fraction of the value. But the value of these things was still hundreds of millions of dollars at the end of the day, or tens of millions of dollars. So what do? They created a new class of people called the oligarchs, which are still around to this day. And now the oligarchs spend their time buying football clubs and biggest yachts in the world and all that sort of stuff. So in essence, what happened in Russia was the privatization of state-owned enterprises, but to cronies, to cadres, not to the general public. We are saying every single voter gets a share of the SOEs. It's a completely different system entirely. It's not just privatizing in favor of someone else. It's people's capitalism, privatizing in favor of everyone, in every citizen, every voter in the country. And with that, sorry, gentlemen, I need to be on my way. Enjoy the rest of the stream.
Cheers, Ramon.
All right. And, so another question that has popped up from Gopalong Lakoto, Ramaphosa said that shutting down SAA would mean that we pay off the debt immediately. This debt would impact other SOEs and may collapse our fiscus. Actually, well, the whole point is that government currently is the guarantor of that debt in any case. But is Ramaphosa effectively saying that because we are in a hole, instead of trying to fill that hole immediately and take the pain now, we should just keep digging the hole deeper? No, it's utter rubbish. The SAA could be sold off in its entirety right now as a going concern. The only reason why our government chooses to not sell off SAA in the short term is because it is an ego project for the government. And they have this absurd idea that we need to have a national carrier, a national flag carrier that represents us, so that we can pretty much land our planes on the rest of the continent and just show the rest of Africa really how wonderful we are. No, it's utter rubbish. Duncan, anything you want to say on that point?
I agree with you completely on SAA. I mean, why on earth are we running a state-owned airline? I mean, the other carriers will take up these routes. Why? I think it's an ideological hang-up of the ANC government that the word privatization is a dirty word to them, and I think it makes no sense for the state to be involved in many of these state-owned enterprises, be it the state airline, be it in telecommunications for that matter. Why does the government still own a 40% stake in Telkom? It makes no sense. They say it's strategic, but strategic in what way? I mean, the market is competitive. MTN, Vodacom, Cell C, others all competing. We don't need government involved in the sector at all. So as far as I'm concerned, they should just get out. I really like the idea of this, of giving shares in these state-owned enterprises to citizens. But the one question I wanted to ask, actually, Kansan, was, the state is in a bit of a hole from a debt perspective. There are some good state-owned enterprises around still, Telkom being one of them, albeit a portion of its shares being listed on the JSE. Would it not make some more sense, perhaps, to sell the state-owned enterprises to the highest bidders rather than making their shares available to citizens?
I think you're absolutely right on that. But essentially, we need to take the view that in order to get to that stage, first hand over ownership directly to people who would then be in a position to make that decision. Now, from my point of view, as a shareholder in Telkom, for example, on the assumption that I have that fraction of the 40% shareholding in Telkom, and if there's a possibility that I could immediately, more than double my money by simply selling that off to the highest bidder, I would certainly, as a shareholder, then vote for that to be done. And so, yes, you're right. It makes absolute sense for us to be able to do that. But this government is not going to be willing to do that. So the first step has to be to transfer ownership directly to people who then would make the intelligent decision. But Duncan, there's something that I wanted to toss in your direction, because it is part of your zone of expertise. Broadband Infraco is one of the state-owned enterprises, which and I had the chance to go through their statement of financial position, their balance sheet, with a bit of a fine-tooth comb. And they have 1.5 billion in assets, but they are something like 3 billion in debt. And the question really is, broadband InfraCo, what role is it really playing in our economy right now? Is there any reason to keep that one alive?
I think the short answer to that is no, but there's an interesting history with broadband InfraCo because it was the brainchild of the former Public Enterprises Minister, Alec Irwin. He was frustrated by the slow pace of liberalization that the former late Minister of Communications, Dr. Ivy Matsepe-Kasaburi, was implementing reforms in the sector. And I think that Irwin's solution, was to create another state-owned enterprise to compete with the existing state-owned enterprise, namely Telkom, in an effort to bring down prices. So it was the statist controlling solution rather than opening up the market to competition. The thing that actually ended up opening the market to competition more than anything else was the decision by Altec, at the time run by Craig Fenter, to challenge Matsepe-Kasaburi's slow pace of liberalization. They called it managed liberalization. And that court judgment in Altec's favor actually had a huge impact on the market because it allowed independent fiber operators, for example, to start to roll out infrastructure that competed with Telkom. Up to that point, Telkom was the only company that was able to provide that infrastructure to you and me in our homes. And we've obviously seen the rise of companies like Vumatel and others, Dark Fiber Africa, and we've seen, and of course, new undersea cable operators, and that has brought down the price of broadband in South Africa, particularly fixed line broadband, substantially over the years. So no, I think to circle back to broadband InfraCo, I think they've singularly shown that they are incapable of competing with the private sector. I think they're a direct competitor to Dark Fiber Africa, and Dark Fiber Africa has done a fantastic job of rolling out fiber infrastructure both nationally and in metropolitan areas, and the impact of that has been the price of broadband has come down significantly. Broadband InfraCo hasn't been able to compete, and in fact, I believe their prices have continued to remain higher than the private sector offering. So, what point do they actually? What are they actually bringing to the table that the private sector can't? And I think that they're an obvious candidate for breaking up and selling off of their assets to private sector entities.
So it's another one of those entities that's going to continue digging a hole deeper and deeper unless we as the shareholders actually take a decision to shut it down. Someone makes a point, Harley Wolford says, our country is poorly educated. If I'm not mistaken, most don't have matric. Will the majority be able to make good decisions regarding keeping or selling shares? I think our view as ZACP generally has been that you can trust people to manage their own money or their own wealth far better than you can trust government to manage it on their behalf. And we've used the same argument in terms of how, social grants get distributed or tax refunds get distributed. People will generally allocate that money in a way that is going to best serve their own interests. And sure, you're going to get a handful of people who are going to, end up drinking the money away or spending it on drugs or whatever. But by and large, I think our belief very strongly is that the people of this country are best trusted to manage their own financial affairs. That is the inherent nature of capitalism. And so I think that we should not work on the assumption that because people are poorly educated, they are incapable of acting in their best interests. I know a lot of political parties take that particular view. I think it's patronizing. I think we need to give people credit, more credit than we currently give them. Just taking a quick look in terms of the other questions. What about the metro rail? Who should be in charge of them? The cities in which they are? I think we've addressed this the particular question in terms of metro rail previously, and really the view is that metro rail control should be split up and should be passed down to local authorities. So in the case of metro rail in the Western Cape, it should be handed over to the likes of my city so that it becomes part of an integrated transport network out there. In Gauteng, it might be logical to actually hand that over to the Gauteng Transport Authority, so that you can effectively have a merger between metro rail and the Gautrain, and effectively have integration and single ticketing across all of those. But that's very different from Transnet infrastructure and maintenance of the rail network, which currently is held by Transnet at the national level. And the idea is really that one should take a view again of splitting up Transnet into those various components. Someone that actually runs rail infrastructure, someone that manages rolling stock, someone that manages stations, as the case may be. But we will be in a position to do that breakup if control is directly in the hands of shareholders. Once again, let's see what other questions we've got. So Quinton Davis says a voucher system was used, but what happened is that most people sold off their shares quickly, and these were bought by the same groups of people. I'm not quite sure what the point is meant to be there. The whole idea behind handing out shares is that people should feel free to be able to sell the shares or to hold on to them as they see fit. If you use our model that says that right now, by allocating shares to everyone, it effectively ends up being a net worth of roughly 50,000 Rand per shareholder as a minimum. Now, I, as a person who happens to be living in a small town in the middle of the Eastern Cape, as an example, might want to take that 50,000 Rand, sell those shares, take the 50,000 Rand and use it as startup capital for a business, which I'm currently not able to afford to do because the bank is not willing to give me a loan. So that's why we talk about it being a way in which we can actually hand real empowerment over to people by breaking up these state-owned enterprises and passing the shares on directly to people at grassroots level. Duncan?
I fully agree with that. I think it makes absolute sense. And what I really like about this model is the Germans did something similar. I mean, it certainly wasn't the entire populace, but the way they managed unions, and I'm not an expert on the German model, but they've implemented a form of stakeholder capitalism where they got employees of companies, of state-owned enterprises, and of private enterprises onto the boards of directors. So union representation took place at board level, and I think that has worked well for them. I know this is not the same model that's being proposed here, but that sort of getting everyone involved in the running of business can be very powerful. And I don't think that. I certainly think it's worth trying, even if we start with a few state-owned enterprises to see how it works out, and then expanding it further. But I think the model is a good one, and I'd love to see it put into practice.
Well, I think that we pretty much covered all of the questions up until now. So, once again, just to recap, what we said up front. Basically, the proposal that we've tabled is that we want government ownership of state-owned enterprises to be handed over directly to the citizens of South Africa, which is a model that has been carried out very successfully in parts of Eastern Europe with the breakup of communism post-1989. And it effectively ends up putting the cash equivalent of 50,000 Rand per registered voter in terms of our current business model. Obviously, if we extend it to all adult citizens, then that amount goes down fractionally. But yes, the whole idea is that it ends up being real empowerment in forms of cash that goes down directly into the pockets of citizens. So I think let's wrap up at that point. Duncan, anything you want to say before we close?
No, I'm good. Sorry I was a bit late for the video. I just rushed in from a meeting, busy doing capitalistic things, but glad I managed to catch the tail end of it.
Excellent. And thank you everyone who tuned in. Tomorrow at the same time, we will be doing a town hall with Neo Kwaho talking fourth industrial revolution type stuff. So please join in on that. And this broadcast will, of course, be up on our YouTube channel. So please tell your friends about it if they've actually missed it. And of course, you'll be able to continue to ask us questions in the usual places on social media. Thank you.
Cheers.